Well, getting a chance to do this, I tell you, the Muppets have had such a huge influence on people around the world from every aspect.
Yeah.
And getting a chance to step into that void after the loss of Jim Henson.
Yes.
Can you walk us through, I mean, how daunting a task is that to be the next voice, to follow a legend?
It was pretty scary, as you might imagine. I knew Jim very well. We had worked together for about 12 years prior to his death. He hired me to work with the Muppets when I was 18. So he was really a teacher to me, as he was to many people, not just me. But I came in at a great time when there was tons of Muppet work. Gave me the opportunity to really learn. When I showed up, I think I probably thought, you know, I've been doing puppets as a kid, and I thought I kind of knew what I was doing. And it turned out I had a lot to learn, as you might imagine. Jim was an incredible teacher, incredible collaborator, so, and a great friend, you know. So to have just lost him, as a surprise, we didn't know Jim was going to pass away, and it was a sudden thing. It was an infection that he got. And then be asked to take over not just a Muppet character, but this character that was so identified with him. You know, when people, it had gotten to the point where of all the people who worked with the Muppets, you knew that if you were a Muppet person, you knew Jim Henson was Kermit the Frog. So that was scary, and yet I knew I needed to do it. And as it turned out, evidently, although he and I never spoke about it, he had mentioned the idea of me possibly doing Kermit at that point, not in his death, but because he was selling his company to the Walt Disney Company, and which didn't happen when he died. But I think he thought he was going to be too busy to continue to be Kermit. And Jim wasn't one to hang on to things, you know. He was happy to let Kermit pass on and kind of this lineage thing, and I think that's what was going to happen, perhaps. But in any event, because he had mentioned that to some of his closest people, they asked me to do it after his death. And the daunting part was trying to make sure, you know, my voice was never exactly Jim's voice. It was mostly about trying to keep the character intact, trying to keep him who he was to begin with, but you couldn't let it just be a copy, because he would just have been a stale character who would have never changed. I'd just be copying Jim. So I had to really rely on having been around him, what I knew of Jim as a person, and where Kermit came from within Jim. That was really the only way to make it work.
Well, and this character, like you said, was so much a part of Jim, so much a part of what he did. I mean, I remember my dad waking me up one night, and he goes, "Come here, I want you to watch this." And I said, "What?" And he turns on the TV, and Kermit the Frog's hosting The Tonight Show.
Oh, I remember that very well.
I was wondering what surreal world my dad and I are sitting up at 10:30 at night watching, hey, how's everybody doing? And blah, blah, behind Johnny Carson's desk. And you're like, what is happening in this world? And then I've watched, I love Muppet stuff, so I've watched every video I could melt into. And it's funny when Jim is sitting there and he's got Kermit in his lap and he's talking, and I wonder how this happened for you as well, how people will talk but their eyes go to Kermit and they forget Jim is sitting right there. And then you see them get like, Arsenio Hall was like, I can't stop looking at Kermit. Right? He's like, is it weird when you're doing these interviews and you've got Kermit and you realize suddenly you're really not there? It's an extension of something else.
I think it's kind of a compliment when that happens in a way, because the idea is that these characters, I certainly always approached what we did as that these characters were real entities in the world. They were just like any of us. They weren't puppets and they weren't me, but Kermit was Kermit. And I think was the best approach. And that's because they not only lived in their on-screen world, but we had them live in the real human world. So to me, it wasn't enough for them to just be on. They needed an off-screen persona as well. I thought that was important. And for that reason, and I didn't appear that often with Kermit with me. Once in a while, I would do something like this, and we would have Kermit. But it really was as though another person joined the stage. You know, it wasn't like it was me doing a puppet. And when the attention went to Kermit, it was kind of gratifying to know that people were joining in, you know, suspending that disbelief and joining in on the fun. And I always kind of felt that all of the characters that we did were kind of a collaboration between us and the audience. You know, if you guys, if people like you didn't believe that, you didn't want to believe that they were alive, or at least pretend they were alive, then it would have never worked. You know.
How often did you have to bandy between one or two or maybe even three characters all at the same time with voices?
We never did that. We never did
really?
that.
Okay.
You know, the person who did that, who was amazing. Did anybody remember Sherry Lewis?
Right.
Yeah. Whoa. Yeah. She was remarkable, and I got to meet her when she was doing her show that she did for a little while there. And because she was a ventriloquist, even though on that show she was usually doing the characters, she would sit behind a puppet wall, and they would have the camera. She would do both puppets at the same time, talking to each other. I could never have done that. We didn't work that way. But she always did two characters at once. It's just the way her brain divided, you know. We always concentrated on one character at a time. You know, there are those massive Muppet scenes you might see where occasionally in the background we might have two puppets on. But whenever the characters had real dialogue, we would do whichever of our characters had the most lines, and then someone else would puppeteer the other character, and we would dub the voice later, you know, as much as possible.
I remember, I can't remember which one of the museums I was at. It might have been the Television Museum in Illinois. They had a deal set up with the Muppets, but they showed how the Muppeteers, is that the right term, Muppeteers?
It's good. There are many terms.
Would
Some
work
we
this.
wouldn't repeat in public.
Right.
Yeah.
But you would, if I understand this correctly,
Yeah.
you guys would have TV monitors in
Yes.
front of you, and you would be working this way. How hard is that to, you know, to be doing the different things and keeping track of making sure you're in the right lighting? I mean, it's one thing to sit here and know you've got the light on your face, you've got the right angle, but to be this has got to be just very hard to work on.
It's a different way, and it became like, I think for all of us, a little bit like riding a bicycle. You just do it. It's just what we do. Some puppeteers that I've known over the years, you know, I don't know whether you guys know this, if you've ever stood in front of a camera and watched yourself on the monitor, everything is backwards. You know, you turn this way, and on the monitor it's going this way, so if you're turning a puppet, it's backwards. So you just get used to that. You know where you are in space, and I know you're doing a puppet over here, so I know when I turn that way, I'm looking at your puppet just instinctively, but you get used to what that feels like on the monitor and finding your way around looking at something other than the puppet. And the purpose of that, Jim always worked that way. And a lot of that was about seeing what the audience was going to see in the final product. So we basically were our own audience while we were working. And it facilitated making sure that whatever they did worked. And we would have little cheats. Like, one thing that you probably wouldn't notice is that when the Muppets would turn, I know from an actor, if we're working with a live actor, we didn't necessarily, the character wasn't necessarily looking into the eyes of the actor. He might be looking over there. It's just a cheat. We would always try to cheat so you see both eyes on the character a little bit, you know. Probably disorienting for an actor who's playing alongside us. But, you know, you learn all those little cheats and moves and eye lines and ways to find them, you know. Very important stuff to us. The eye lines are really a big deal.
Well, I remember when we lost Jim and the Muppets were going to move forward, I remember personally going, there can never be another Kermit the Frog. Yeah. I don't know how, you know, it was like when Mel Blanc passed away, and then to just anything else was somebody imitating Bugs Bunny to me. Right. And then I slowly started warming up, and then the Muppet Christmas Carol. Yeah. And right? Yeah. I mean, am I wrong? I not saying I forgot Jim Henson, but I was back in the world of the Muppets, and I got teary-eyed watching it. It was just, it was magical again to be there. Was that satisfying to realize that, you know, I know there had to be a lot of hate, there had to be a lot of, let's just call it a day, retire Kermit, and let's bring Robin up and have him mature, right? Now he can be the new Kermit. But was it gratifying to see that that exploded?
Yeah, it was.
Was it surprising, I guess?
I don't know. I wasn't really thinking in those terms at the time. For me, it was all about concentrating on trying to keep that character consistent. I would have never been able to do this had I not known Jim, had I not spent time with Jim. It was the only thing that made it possible because, as I said, they were so associated. But of course, it was gratifying that it started to work. And there were always people who thought it didn't work. You know, you always have your critics. But I think I keep going back to this, but it really was all about the idea of keeping Jim's influence a part of that character And as long as Kermit stayed as true as possible to who he was, I think it helped facilitate the other characters that have had new puppeteers stay strong as well. It really is an ensemble thing. If Kermit doesn't work, then the other characters start to not quite work, you know? So it was important that the other thing was we just didn't want him to become stale. He needed to grow, and you brought up Christmas Carol and Treasure Island. Suddenly I was cast into doing these films where it was, yes, I'm trying to do Kermit, and I'm trying to keep Kermit consistent, but Kermit was actually playing roles. It was Kermit playing, so it was like all this remove, you know, Captain Smollett on the ship is Kermit, me playing Kermit. And my instinct was, and it was sort of confirmed for me, you guys know who Frank Oz is.
Right.
Who's incredible individual as well as an amazing originator with the Muppets. And Frank mostly directs these days, incredible film director. But Frank and I did a little session together. I don't know if I've ever told this story. It might be a new one. And I won't go on forever.
No,
but
please.
We did a little session shortly after Jim passed away and after I had had a moment to think about doing Kermit, where we got together in New York, and Frank and I just got on cameras in a private space, and I did Kermit, and he did Miss Piggy, and I did Kermit, and he did Fozzie Bear. And the funny part of that was, I was a little nervous about it. I knew Frank, we'd worked together for years, but not quite in this capacity, you know. Suddenly I'm trying to do what Jim did, you know, and I can only imagine it must have been very hard for Frank. They were so close. But what I discovered is that as soon as Frank was doing his characters, and they were so solid in who they were, Kermit just started to come out of me in this funny way. It's as though those characters really existed outside of the men who originated them, you know? And once they were together and Piggy was Piggy, then I knew what Kermit should do. It just started to happen because I remembered what Jim had done, and I felt an instinct about it. And Frank told me after that, he said, you know, what you have to do when you approach Kermit, at least for a while, you have to perform Jim. And that was a killer. I mean, I even had an instinct for it, and it was very hard because we're still mourning his death, and really tough. But I kind of had to first put my mindset into at least what my interpretation of Jim Henson was, and then let that turn into Kermit. It was once removed, you know. So to whatever extent I was able to do it, which I was proud of the work in the end, I go back to saying it was all about keeping Jim's influence in the character, you know.
With that, were there times in the new iterations and the new stories that you felt you had to stand up for Kermit, stand up for the characters so that they remained true to what they were? And did they ever look at you like, you know, this is a puppet, right?
Well, they looked at me in many ways for many reasons. Just between me and 100,000 people, it's why I'm not with the Muppets anymore. But you guys know I'm not with the characters anymore. And a lot of that is I felt we had started to part ways with who they were. I always tried to do that diplomatically. But what happened was we ended up with the Walt Disney Company. They are enormously talented people who really loved the Muppets, and yet they didn't really know, many of the executives didn't know the Muppets from the inside. And I could guide that along with the other guys who were around Jim to a certain degree, but it just started getting further and further away for me. So, you know, at the end of the day, it wasn't going to get back, you know, as far as I was concerned. So I thought, well, if I'm ever going to do anything else in my life that I might want to do, maybe it's time for me to do some other things. And I've started doing a few new characters based on that. But yeah, I did try to stand up for it, but I tried to do it in a way that was not confrontational. I really tried to say, you know, it's a corporation. So you're sitting around a boardroom table and you can say, well, we all, you know, had this wonderful time and everybody felt great when we worked for Jim. That's not exactly what they want to hear at a boardroom table. So I tried to translate that into how the Muppets are going to be successful because this is what we need to do. Sometime it worked and sometime it didn't, you know. But, you know, it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing to take what was kind of a mom and pop company and install it in a very large company and keep it faithful to what it was, you know.
How hard a job is that to walk away from, especially knowing the keys, keys to the car were basically handed to you by Dad? and then have to walk away from that car at some point.
Yeah. Well, it's not easy. If there's any regret about that, it's simply that a lot of what could have stayed, that Jim influence, will probably not get passed along now because there's almost no one left who was a part of that time frame. Now, I'm not saying, it's not a what would Jim do kind of situation, because Jim was always moving to the next thing. He never looked at his past work that I saw. I tried to get him to sit down and watch one of his old TV specials with me one time, and he very politely said, "Do you mind if I don't?" It was something, it was like The Frog Prince, or one of his early shows from the 70s, and he said, that was then and now's now, and I really want to. He didn't want to be re-influenced by the stuff he used to do. He wanted to move to the next thing and the next thing. But when things evolve, which is what I think it should do, that's really about, evolution is not about things just changing. It's about it being based on a solid foundation, and it grows. But it doesn't lose that essence of what it is. So that was super important to me, and it still is. Anything I ever do going forward is still an expression of what I learned with Jim. That's the point.
All right, now, and I want to open up for questions as well from the audience. If you have a question, raise your hand. Dalton, where are you, my friend? Here he is. Dalton will come around and catch you. If you can state your name and clearly ask your question, thank you.
Hi, my name is Ben,
Yes,
and
no.
we met. I always loved seeing Muppet characters working with human characters written into the storyline. One of my favorites is Doc and Sprocket.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about working with Jerry Parks and how the characters work together?
Yeah, Fraggle was, I've said this to many of you that I've met, was my favorite project that I ever worked on, hands down, above everything. I was about 23 years old when we started doing that show, so I was very young still with the Muppets. But I'd been there about 5 years. And Jim used to say that it took about he was absolutely right. It took about 5 to 7 years for anyone that he brought in to get really accustomed to the way he liked to do things. And that was true for me. It really took me 5 years to get comfortable, because I didn't come from an acting background. I came from the technical puppetry background. So a lot of what I had to learn within Jim's company was how you create a character. And by the time a character like Wembley Fraggle or Sprocket came along, I was getting more and more comfortable with that. I remember the first time we ever did a rehearsal with, you guys know who Sprocket was, the dog on Fraggle Rock?
Right.
And along with this very well-known Canadian actor named Jerry Parks, who had done a lot of dramatic television. And Sprocket was not meant to speak English. He was meant to make dog noises. But he still had to convey what he was saying. And it was a real challenge. And at the end of the day, I remember I always felt a little bit sorry for Jerry Parks, because it turned out to be his job. He had to not only learn his lines, he had to learn everything that Sprocket was trying to convey, because he's the one who had to actually convey it. I mean, I was doing it, but in case you didn't understand what Sprocket just did, Jerry had to repeat it. So it was a grand time, and Jerry was a terrific person. And I loved every minute of it. I mean, it was great. It was a terrific little partnership, And I should also mention with Sprocket, I worked with a puppeteer named Karen Prell, who some of you may know, who was also Red Fraggle on that show and many other projects. And Karen was the other half of Sprocket. Many of our characters take 2 people to perform. Karen was Sprocket's other hand and his tail. So Karen was always there, and she was terrific at it. Whenever I worked with assistant puppeteers, I always loved if I didn't have to, tell them everything to do, because I'm trying to concentrate on my part. And Karen was terrific at following my lead, and it was a great time. Yeah.
It's funny that you say that, you weren't used to acting, you were just the technical puppet.
Yeah.
But that is, I mean, you're making a piece of cloth or fabric show emotion. I mean, that's got to be the hardest acting in the world.
Yeah, you know what it was? It wasn't as much, you're right. I mean, it is just acting like any other acting. It was that I had never done a lot of character development. So to come in with a new character that I didn't know and figure out who that character was going to be was a leap for me, at that point in my life.
I get it, a leap for you.
Oh, yeah, that's a little frog joke.
Nice. Very. Do you have a question, ma'am? Right up here, Dalton. Right there, Dalton. Right there. Bam.
My name is Shannon. Yes. And my question is, what's your favorite puppet that you've done?
Yeah, my favorite character that I ever did was Rizzo the Rat. Yeah. He was always this snarky little smart aleck guy who was, this little guy with all this, kind of pep and spunk, and the polar opposite of a character like Kermit, really personality-wise. And Rizzo just, for me, kept getting better and better as I got older and more, whatever it is happens, I don't know, senile. But he got more and more grouchy, which was kind of fun, and more and more sarcastic. And I got better at doing that. And as he developed, his New York accent got stronger and stronger, which lended itself to that character. So I loved Rizzo as my favorite character I ever did. Fraggle was my favorite project overall, but Rizzo was always the favorite character. Yeah.
It's funny how that all the work that happened in the Muppets, how it bleeds through any kind of property. I have got the worst OCD with this, right? I do a radio show that talks about paranormal phenomena.
Yes.
Do, 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 do. Every time. And if anybody here listens to my radio show,
yeah.
I have to turn my microphone off and bite my knuckles every time my partner on the show goes, yeah, this is strange phenomena. And then half the time. And then he stops and he looks at me and he sees me going,
yeah.
Do, 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 do. And if I don't, people write in and they're like, what the, where's the do, 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 do?
Yeah.
He said phenomena 8 times and you never responded. And then every voice, whether I'm talking Bigfoot or the devil,
yeah.
comes out sounding like Rolf the dog.
Yeah, exactly.
And
exactly.
my kids laugh. My partner's like, Dave, that's not the devil, that's Rolf the dog. You're crazy. Rolf sounds totally different. And then Bigfoot. Oh, here's Bigfoot. No, Dave, that's Rolf the dog. No, I'm pretty damn sure it's Bigfoot. But it just, once it's in their brain, it's no getting out. Yes.
Well, I know it does stay in our heads. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, look at this guy.
Yeah, I know.
Kermit the Frog. Has there been any celebrities that you've worked with on Sesame Street or in your guest starring role,
Sure.
if you will, in interview circumstances that you've been starstruck by?
Yeah, there have been a number. We did the Muppet Show. We had a different guest star every week. And again, I was 18 when I started. And a lot of these stars were people that I'd grown up with, and even my parents had grown up with. Some of these classic stars of Hollywood, like Bob Hope and Danny Kaye and Gene Kelly and people like that. But starstruck. I made a complete fool of myself with David Bowie when we did Labyrinth. And he forgave me, which was terrific. And Tim Curry, too, as a matter of fact. I was a huge Tim Curry fan. And Brian Henson actually, kind of on purpose, embarrassed me in front of Tim. He said, we were walking across the studio a lot as we were about to shoot Treasure Island. Tim's there, we're going to do rehearsals. And Brian said, I'm not sure Steve is going to own up to this, but he's actually a really fanatic. Fanatic fan is redundant, but over your work. And Tim and I became friends over that. Had great conversations. But both of them I was a little starstruck by.
What was I've got to ask, because I don't care if you care, I care.
Okay.
David Bowie.
Yeah. Oh, it was amazing.
Was it just being on set? I mean, watching the guy, he created something amazing. I understand he's acting and a director's kind of leading him through this, but you forget it's David Bowie. He is just that character. There's no denying. I mean, when you think of it, I almost keep those two characters separated, and that's unbelievable. In most acting, an actor is always Chevy Chase is always Chevy Chase, right? Tim Allen's always Tim Allen. Yeah. David Bowie is whoever he wants to be,
he did
right?
A bit of a transformation. Yeah. He was a really talented actor in everything he ever did. My quick story about David Bowie. I'll tell you the story where I made a complete ass of myself. We had a little party at Jim's house before we started shooting the week before, for all of us to meet. Many of us knew each other, but to meet the people who were working on Labyrinth. David was there, and Jennifer Connelly and her family, everybody. So, and I'm still quite young. And I was kind of in awe of him because I was such a massive fan of his work. And I used to be in rock bands in high school, and I played his music and all this stuff, So I was introduced to him. We're standing around. He's here. And Jim may have introduced us. Shake hands. He's very humble and quiet. And what I learned about David is he did not particularly have any need to talk about himself. He loved his work. He loved that you loved his work. But it didn't matter. He would have done it anyway. So you didn't need to compliment him. And I said something like, you'll have to forgive me if throughout the first couple of weeks of shooting, I'm staring at you a lot because I just owned up to it. I said, I'm a big fan, I'm a little bit in awe of you. And he smiled, but he took a step back. And he said, thank you. And I thought, oh my God, I've blown it with him. We haven't even started shooting yet.
Immediately, visions of himself locked in
Yeah.
your car trunk started to pop in the head.
I just thought he's never going to speak to me throughout the whole shoot.
Right.
And about a week into the shooting, for whatever reason, we went to see the dailies, which is the stuff you shot the day before. We're leaving the theater. We've shot all day. Somebody comes running up behind me, and somebody will put their hands on your shoulder and kind of push themselves off the ground. It was him. I don't know why. For some reason, he chose me that day. And he said, I got to go up. He was in the makeup. He said, I've got to go up and get out of makeup. Why don't you come up, we'll talk. It was just, talk about a fanboy moment. And I have to tell you, we were shooting in the north of England, and I had a car that drove me back and forth every day. I did not drive. And my first honest thought was, there's no way I'm not going to do this, but how am I going to get home? Anyway, I got home, and I got to spend all this, hours talking to David Bowie.
Wow.
It was incredible,
Very
Yeah.
cool. All right, Dalton.
Thanks. My name's Tom. Was there any character that you had the voice before you got the Muppet? That you pushed through going, I've got this great voice.
Yeah. It almost always went hand in hand. The voice that I use for Rizzo is a very similar tone as what I would use for this character called Bean Bunny or Wembley Fraggle. It's a voice that came naturally to me. And because it did, I used it for many, many characters. I've got a story about that too. So in a way, that voice came prior to those characters. But again, because my approach to this was about the puppetry, I wasn't saying, I've got this great voice that would be great for a rat. It was just anybody can do a couple of voices. Some of us have many. I don't have that many, frankly. I do variations on voices. But I remember when we did a show called The Bunny Picnic with this little character called Bean Bunny. And I've been doing Rizzo and Wembley at that point. I felt very good about Wembley. And I remember walking across the soundstage as we were rehearsing The Bunny Picnic with Jim. And I said, I'm frustrated about this, Jim. I don't want to do the same voice for every character all the time. I'd like to do something different for Bean Bunny. He wanted me to do the same. He liked that voice, just without the Rizzo accent or the certain affectations Wembley had. And this was in the 80s, and Burt Reynolds was very popular. He was doing all these Cannonball Run movies. And Jim was one of these, he was very thoughtful before he said things. And he said, well, whenever Burt Reynolds does a film, he always uses the same voice. And I had this moment, I said, you're right. He never changes his voice. And Jim said, stick with the voice. It's a good voice. So, I did. I mean, that voice got me through a lot of characters. I'm trying to see where Dalton is.
Right there.
Okay.
I know Hell Girl on the end here keeps raising her
Yes,
giant
yes,
hand
right
at
here.
us. Yes.
Well, yeah, we'll pass it back down.
Hi, Steve Whitmire.
Hello, sir.
My name is Cole.
I know.
I know that we've met, but I have a question for you.
Okay.
When you were on the set doing Kermit and Jerry Nelson was doing Robin in the Elves and the Shoemaker
Yes.
segment from Muppet Classic Theater, could you not perform Rizzo at the same time? Was there someone else to do Rizzo who, like Gonzo, whose performer got on stage?
Yes. So you're saying, when someone else does one of our characters, yeah. We did a thing years ago called Muppet Classic Theater, which some of you may have seen, some of you may have never heard of. But it was a great little piece where we did these kind of fractured fairy tales. It was silly versions of fairy tales. Yeah, so whenever we would do two characters in the same scene at the same time, someone else would do our second character, and then we would go back afterwards and do the voice. So it sounded like the same. And we usually would talk to that puppeteer who was going to do our other character, and sometimes they would ask us, we would give them line readings. They say, how would you say this? So I would do the line, and then they would try to do the same thing, It's really funny, though. A lot of times it's very difficult to go back and dub with the Muppets, even though you think you could fit anything into their mouths, but the rhythms are sometimes, all of our rhythms are different. And I might think I was doing one of Frank's characters exactly like Frank would do it, and Frank would go back to dub it, and it was completely off. He had trouble putting Piggy's voice in Piggy's mouth if I did it or something like that, you know. Yes.
So, have you ever had kind of like in your daily life a character come through on his own, like on their own, kind of just their personality comes out?
Yeah. Well, you know, I can't think of an example, but I'm sure it must. I mean, all of these characters are obviously aspects of us, you know, like any actor would do. And there's a part of me that has some Rizzo, and there's a part of me that had a little bit of Kermit, and all those things.
What's wrong with Rolf the dog?
And you clearly have a great deal of Rolf the dog.
My ex-wife will tell you that. All dog.
That's funny because I was about to say you'd have to ask my wife if that comes out. Yeah, I'm sure it does. I'm sure it does. I don't intentionally do it. You know, it's funny. Jim's approach to the characters, he wasn't all that precious about them in a way. He really looked at these puppets, I think, as our tools. It's what we did. The Muppets, when they started out back in the 50s and 60s, were an act that went on variety shows. And when people said, it's the Muppets, they were referring as much to the men who were doing, and women, who were doing the puppetry as they were the puppets. It wasn't really until the Muppet Show that suddenly the Muppets were Kermit and Miss Piggy and Fozzie. It was really about these guys who did things with puppets. You know, the Muppets were like Monty Python's Flying Circus or one of those, you know, a repertory company.
Do you remember who the first Muppet was to make it big?
I think it was probably Rolf, the dog. Okay, what a coincidence.
Who knew?
You remember, if anybody's here besides me is old enough to remember the Jimmy Dean show back in the early 60s, Rolf was this character who was suddenly the sidekick of this country singer named Jimmy Dean, who went on to sell sausage. Same guy. I think God, I'm being taped. I think he's still alive. Is Jimmy Dean still alive? I think he is.
It's okay. He's not watching anyway.
He's probably not watching. I think he's still around. Yeah. But, yeah, and I was like 6 years old when that happened. And I remember like saying, actually, my parents, can I stay up and watch Rolf, you know? That's really my first taste of the Muppets was Rolf. And it was black and white TV. And, I remember seeing this thing with this big mouth. You know, Rolf had this big black mouth, especially on a black and white television. And thinking, I knew it was a puppet even when I was 6. And I thought, that must be how you get in there. You must climb in through the mouth, you know? Yeah.
Hi, Joe, local. Gotta ask, from the standpoint of a puppeteer, you started this when you were 18. At some point, you had to tell your family or your parents, this is my new job. Was anyone ever kind of question that at the time?
Well, I think they were pretty happy that it happened because I remember when I was about 14 years old. Okay, this is an interesting thing. Back pre-internet, back when I was a kid, the way of being a fan for me was TV Guide magazine, which was a paper magazine at that point. They had a yellow page in the front and a yellow page in the back. Those pages were something like the TV bulletin, but one was New York, one was LA, and once in a while, they would say what the Muppets were about to do. They'd say, Jim Henson's doing a new special. That was all I had to go on. And I'd carry that around with me for months, you know. Oh, this special's going to be on. And I remember there was an article about Jim in one of those magazines, like TV Guide, and it said, you know, I don't know whether this is even accurate, but they said, last year, you know, Jim Henson had a great success. His company made $200,000, which at that point was a lot of money. And I remember showing it to my dad and saying, look, you know, like saying you can make a living at this, you know. And I remember my poor dad, you know, very traditional, wonderful father, but saying, you know, you might want to have a backup. What if this puppet thing doesn't work out? Oh, but it will. I wasn't even looking for a job with the Muppets. I just thought it's going to work. But I think they were pretty happy when it actually turned into something I did for all these years. Both my parents are gone now, but for years my dad just come and say, "What if I had not let you do that? You know, wouldn't it have been terrible?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I think I probably would have done it anyway." You know.
All right, Dalton, where are you? All right.
Oh.
Hi, Steve. David.
Hey.
David, we talked earlier.
Yes.
One of the things we were talking about was the amount of detail in the background. Like Wembley is in the background listening to a conversation, and you're having them look back and forth and silently judge the people as they're talking or whatnot.
Yeah.
But for me, the detail I'm wondering about is the dozers.
Doozers.
Doozers.
Close enough.
Yeah. When I think bulldozer, but whatever.
Yeah.
When they were in the background, they were very, very small, but there would be scenes where you would zoom in.
Yeah.
And did you have to use different puppets at that time to get more articulation? Because they look very stick figurey when they're small, but when they're big, they had all this great articulation.
Yeah, they were. All the versions of them were small. The Doozers were amazing little puppets. They were like the Pillsbury Doughboy. They were these little. They were only about 6 or 8 inches tall, and there's a whole team of people who did nothing but build Doozers. We had some that were on these little sticks that we could run the mouth from down below, so their little mouths worked and we could do the talking. We had some that were radio control that we controlled from a mitt that ran their mouths. When we did that, we would sit at a table like this doing this all day, and there would be another puppeteer who would hold them and move them around, which was really hard to coordinate, very hard to do. They were fun. Anytime we did characters on Fraggle, we all loved our main characters that we were doing, but then we would get to do these auxiliary characters like the Doozers, or I had this really warped one called Marlin Fraggle, who I don't know if anybody remembers this. He had like one eye bigger than the other, so he sounded like Peter Lorre when he talked. He sounded like the Skeksis scientist. But we get to have these little breaks and do other characters, which are always fun, and the Doozers were part of that. And there was a lot of detail. There were whole scenes planned around what they were going to do in the background of the shot while we were doing foreground stuff, Jim was all about upstaging. From my earliest days, he was all about us, the newer puppeteers, grabbing a character, getting in the background of the shot, and doing whatever we wanted to do to draw the attention away from him. He was fine with that. And it's how we learned. It was his way of letting us just learn how to do puppet things,
It just struck me as you're talking about this, how important the Muppets are and the work that Henson and his company created. And if you don't believe that, I'll bring this to your attention. How many people here grew up on the original Star Wars trilogy? Right?
Yeah.
When they replaced Yoda with CGI Yoda, how many of you went, he doesn't even look real? And you're like, he didn't look real, he's a puppet, Dave. No, but he doesn't look real. This is Yoda. This is cartoon Yoda.
Yeah.
And you forget. I mean, it's so weird how you just accept, even though it's something surreal.
Yes.
And out of it, it's much more acceptable than the realism that they've created with CGI.
Yeah.
I was worried that they were going to start going that way with digital puppets.
Yeah.
Kind of like the Lord of the Rings and Planet of the Apes. That's amazing, but I was worried that, they'd just be filming your face doing Kermit the Frog and then just morphing it into a cartoony puppet.
Well,
now.
yeah, it could have happened, and I don't know. These days, it might even be a less expensive way of doing the characters, and frankly, I think Jim would have embraced that kind of technology, but not. I don't think he would have replaced the puppets with it. I think he would have used it to enhance the puppets. There are things that, as much as I love traditional puppetry, that would be easier to do. Like, you want to see a puppet full figure walking? Well, do the top half of the puppet like this, and do the bottom, the legs could be CG. I think that's acceptable. But to completely replace it, I think there's plenty of room for both, and you can do such amazing things with CGI. But I agree with you on Yoda. What struck me the most is when Yoda did that sort of parkour scene where he's bouncing off the walls. Every time I saw that in a theater, people laughed at it. And I thought, I don't think it was meant to be comic. It was supposed to be, this is tough little Yoda, and he looks like a cartoon character, So I felt the same way.
It's weird to say.
Yeah.
But the CGI lost the humanity of the puppet.
Yeah.
Does that sound weird?
Yeah.
Does anybody know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, and Frank did such an amazing job with that character, and it set the stage for things like the Dark Crystal. And as soon as Frank did a character like Yoda, we started, there was a kind of a trend during those days that we started toning down our manipulation. You remember the Muppets on Sesame Street back in the early days, it was just all this craziness. They were wiggling around and moving and jumping up and down. When we did something like the Dark Crystal, we would all sit at these sidewalk cafes in London, and we would do this, and we would watch people walk by from the waist up. And we really started analyzing, I love this part of the work, what do people really look like when they walk? They don't look like this, which is the Muppet walk. It's a little bit more like this. It's this very subtle little thing. Little bit of shoulder movement. It's almost no movement at all. We don't move that much from the waist up when we walk. And so all of that even transferred back to Kermit for me, and for the more abstract Muppets. You know, they became more organic in many, many ways, you know.
I don't know. You and I watch different people because watching these goofballs at the con walk down the halls, it looks like giant Muppets moving around out in the hall. I'm like, what is going on?
This may be an exception, yeah.
Right, yeah. Excellent. All right, where are we at, Dalton?
When I was a kid, I used to watch the original Muppet movie on the Disney Channel.
Yes.
And back in the good old days of Disney Channel, me being a 90s kid, when I saw the movie on the Disney Channel, one scene that interested me was the scene at the end of the movie when Animal turns into a giant at the end of the movie when he scares Doc Hopper and his henchmen away. And I was thinking to myself, how did Animal's head get so huge when his head comes crashing out of the building, and then Doc Hopper and his gang scream, and they're running for their lives when the Animal's going,
a lot like that. You know, and there he is right there. There he is. The Animal's right there. That's an interesting follow-up to what we were talking about, because these days it's very likely people might have done that as a CG thing. And they actually built this animal head that was twice as big as this table and hoisted it on this giant crane. That's why it looks the way it looks. It looks kind of, you know, like a thing that doesn't work very well. But it was a scaled, huge, giant thing as big as this stage that was Animal's head that got pushed up through that roof. You know, a true practical effect. I was going to make a rock and roll drummer joke that they all have big heads, but I guess I just did. But no, it was real. It was a real big giant thing. I have some pictures of it. It's incredible, yeah. 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 Yes. Yes. Right. There's some poor guy under there pulling these giant levers to make that head turn. You know, it was like this huge thing the size of a car. You know?
Wait, what? They didn't just enlarge the actor playing?
Exactly. Well, you see, but that's these days you might actually use the puppet. You might slow it down to make it look big. But Jim built a giant animal. You know.
Very cool.
That's the way we did it. You know. Yeah, Dalton. Oh, you've got it. I'm sorry. Oh, good. I'm sorry, Dalton. Hello, you. Yes. Of course.
Yes, I am here. Hi. You've mentioned the Dark Crystal a couple times, and I was just wondering what your favorite part of puppeteering that was, and like just your entire favorite part of that movie in general.
There were a lot of things about that film that were fun, and some of them were incredibly not fun because it was painful. Inside of those skeksis was really uncomfortable. I remember saying to my wife, also worked on the film. She was Kira's right hand for the film, so she had a puppeteering role in that. And I remember saying to her, remind me how painful this is in the years to come, because I'm going to forget. It's like, I've talked to a lot of women who've done natural childbirth, and they say that you kind of forget the pain. I think the skeksis were a little like that. It was incredibly uncomfortable. And you were dragging all these people around behind you because all the movement was done by these little cables, like the giant animal. So we had 8 people underneath us, and we're trying to walk, and all these people are running on their knees. And, you know, we had some little people who were running cables. And but some of the most fun on that were the pod people, the pod village, the instruments where they're playing the instruments. We charted that music. Like Dave Goelz and I charted that music and made little. Neither one of us read music, but we'd have been better off if we did. We basically did the equivalent of inventing our own music notation, so that we knew every single drum beat and every single playing note of everything, and tried to do that absolutely. We always do that with the Muppets. Try to do accurate, miming of playing instruments and stuff. Yeah, I love that I was able to be a part of that film. It was such a massive undertaking to do that thing, All puppets, state of the art when it was done,
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for being here. I'm a huge Muppet fan.
I see you have a very old Kermit.
That's my mother-in-law gave this to me, and I have to tote it around now.
Yeah, I hear you.
So I was really excited when I heard the Muppet Show was coming back on ABC a while back, because I loved the original format, seeing all of the antics that the Muppets interact with each other.
Yeah.
And when I started watching the Muppet Show, the reboot, it was a completely different format, which
Yeah.
I can kind of understand why. But I feel like it lost a little of that interaction. I was wondering like what your thoughts on it were.
Well, I thought so too in the end. It always sounded like a fun idea, but I think it got too serious. I think the characters got just too serious. I never was crazy about the idea of marketing that show as, well, this is the real life of the Muppets, because I think the fans feel like everything we ever did was the real life of the Muppets. And I was always really conscious of that because, again, I felt like Kermit was a guy who lives in the real world. If I'm going to go on the Tonight Show and talk about Kermit, I want the things that he's done to all add up. It's like the way we all live our lives. It's actually part of his history. And if we're now saying, well, none of that was real, this is who they really are, it was hard. I think we did some really good puppeteering work on that. Puppetry, we did some very complicated, interesting things. And it was a challenge to do that show because the characters were kind of like playing Kermit particularly was almost like dramatic. But I think he got toned down way too much. It was the way it was written. I had to do it, But the fans ruled the day. At least the majority of the fans did, because we got canceled pretty quickly, But I must say, even though there were things that were needed adjustment, I do feel that if we had kept going, it would have fallen into a good slot. It took a while for the whole big machine to see what wasn't working, and I think we would have gotten to a good place. But, when you're doing a primetime TV show, you only get so long. And then they say, okay, you're out,
Hi, I'm Zoe.
Hey, Zoe, yeah.
And I wanted to know what Muppet or puppet was like the hardest to like control.
Yeah. The big ones were always, the bigger puppets are oftentimes hard. I was inside of one of the dinosaurs called Richfield. He was the big mean boss on that show. This huge monster of a thing built by a guy named Tim Rose, who you might run into at a Comic-Con sometime. He's a great guy. I didn't have to take the weight of this thing, but it was like this, like the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. And his mouth was one of these things. And I loved doing it, but it was exhausting. It would have been impossible to take the weight of him. He was supported from above. He was kind of hard. We did a little-known show called The Animal Show, which was on Fox for a little while. I wouldn't be surprised if none of you ever saw it. I did this massive polar bear character who was so much fun, but he was taller than all the other characters. So, we always have this thing where the focus of the eyes is very important. In order for Jake, this polar bear, to look at the other characters who was below him, I always had to do this. And supporting the weight like this is a killer. Your hand will die. It's just horrible. So I had all these wrist problems after that. So anything that's heavy and awkward in a position can be tough. Kermit was easy in that regard because he weighed nothing. Rizzo was small. Small puppets are good. Yeah, it's a good thing.
We have time for one more quick question, and then unfortunately we'll have to wrap it up.
Okay.
Hi, Steve.
Hey.
So music was a huge part of the Muppets.
Yes.
What was your favorite musical performance?
Oh, wow. That's tough. I used to love anything that we did with the Dr. Teeth Band. And I wasn't always involved in that from the point of view. I did this character called Lips, who was the trumpet player. Well, he was kind of this auxiliary guy that popped in once in a while. Jim wanted me to have a character in the band, but everything we did didn't lend itself to a trumpet player, so he was in and out. And I never got to develop that character very much. I had a lot of ideas about him. But the most fun thing I swear to you, in my entire career, was whenever I got to work with Jim doing Rolf's hands on the piano. I oftentimes would do both hands. It was really uncomfortable, but I'm a really bad piano player. But I know where the notes are. I mean, I just can't actually play, and Rolf only had 3 fingers. But I would, and it's a great job for someone who's, has a musical understanding, maybe not a great musician, and an incredible piano player would play these tracks, and I just got to mime them. And so I knew the right part of the piano and the place to play. We did a really, quickly, I know we're running out of time.
No.
But we did a really challenging thing back on the Muppet Show where Liberace, the piano player, he was amazing, and he did a duet with Rolf. The reason this was hard is because Liberace was playing live on the same piano as Rolf, so it was an actual piano. I had Derek Scott, the music director, sitting over here off camera doing Rolf's parts. So it wasn't like I got to go home and have a recorded track that I could learn the notes. I had to make it look like Rolf was playing without actually hitting the keys hard enough to strike the piano strings and then get out of the way. So it had to look real, but it was all this quick stuff between him and Liberace is playing. So it had to be a real piano, you know, one of the hardest things I ever did. And I haven't seen it in a long time, but my memory is that it worked. You know? I hope it did. It's probably on the internet somewhere.
Speaking of music, as we wrap up, you know, when they rebooted with the movie with Jason Segel.
Yes.
Right? I don't know how many people here I'm speaking for, but when they went back into the Rainbow Connection, if you didn't go in the movie theater, I don't know that you're a living human being. Because that was such a beautiful, I remember sitting through that movie through the eyes of a 10-year-old again, watching a bottle cap movie, and just being, you know, and I'm 45, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old when it happened. And I realized, oh my God, I'm 10 years old again. And oh, the Rainbow Connection, the music, the power, the acting, everything. So from the bottom of all of our hearts, thank you
for
carrying on the legacy.
Thanks so much. Thank you all. That's very nice.